So welcome. This is our 16th conversation of Bridges of Belonging. Thank you so much for joining us. And I look forward to introducing you to our two guests in just a moment. I want to begin by acknowledging that I'm on Coast Salish territory here in Victoria today, home of the Esquimalt, Songhees, and Wasanic nations. And I've been so grateful to be safe and welcomed, especially during COVID. My name is Andrea Carey. I'm the Chief Inclusion Officer with Inclusion Incorporated and the host of the English version of Bridges of Belonging. And we have Fanny Smith with us today, who's going to be hosting our French version of Bridges of Belonging starting next week. So would encourage you to join that as well if you can enjoy both languages. So I want to begin with a reading. Today's reading is from Melinda Gates' The Moment of Lift book. And Scout Bassett, who was a guest with us a few weeks ago, who's a Paralympian in the US, had put me onto this book. So I'm just going to read a little snippet from towards the end of the book that really stuck with me this week. It's not easy to transform a culture built on exclusion. It's hard to cooperate with people who want to dominate, but we don't have a choice. We can't just make the insiders the new outsiders and call it change. We have to include everyone, even those who want to exclude us. It's the only way to build the world we want to live in. Others have used their power to push people out. We have to use our power to bring people in. We can't just add one more warring faction. We have to end factions. It's the only way we become whole. So I thought that would be a good way to start today as we talk about our two guests' journey of belonging and the impact that they're having on the world in the space of belonging. So I want to welcome Samantha Rogers and Norma Riley. I'm going to do a brief intro of both of them and then get them to more formally introduce themselves. So Samantha is a social capitalist using sport philanthropy as her vehicle of choice. Samantha is the co-founder of Relate Social Capital, whose specialty is building and implementing revenue generating and community engagement programs. Norma Riley is recognized as one of the leading scholars in the business of sports. He's a professor and founding director of the International Institute for Sport Business and Leadership in the Gordon S. Lang School of Business and Economics at the University of Guelph. And Sam and I have only just met in the last little while. Norm and I have known each other for a number of years through our Paralympic connection. So welcome to both of you. And I'm super excited to have this conversation. I'm going to ask Sam to maybe kick us off by telling us a little bit more about you.
Sure. Well, thank you so much for having me. You kind of captured it right away. My work right now is in sport philanthropy, and I'm really passionate about using sport to do good. It means a lot of different things to a lot of different people, but the good news about that is it's really endless. So I'm based in Montreal. I've lived around Canada. I've worked in a number of different industries. I started off in the charitable sector and really was able to see various impacts happening, whether it was in social services or education or health research. And even though I was passionate about sport, I never realized that the two could function together until I found myself working in college athletics and noticed that there was a huge gap in the market, and I had a really unique skill set to focus in on using sport to do good. And it's been a bit of a wild ride. I think what I'm really grateful for is just all the people that I've met along the way and all of the learnings that have come out of that. And like I said, especially now with the climate today, I think the possibilities are endless in this space, and which is really exciting because there's so much potential there.
Awesome way to kick us off. Sport to do good. I love that. Norm, I'm going to kick it over to you to have you do a bit more of an introduction of yourself.
All right, thanks, Andrea. And it was a nice introduction you gave already, so I'll just add a few things. I've had, like Samantha, a long pathway in sport. I was an athlete, not that good a one, a long time ago, and then kind of got into the business side of sport. I worked for Sport Canada, where I first was exposed to kind of Aboriginal sport and women in sport. That's a long time ago. And then worked for the Toronto Olympic bid. Then I did some stuff in a few other industries. Then I eventually got into the academic side of it and did my PhD and an MBA and a CPA. And I've now been at a bunch of universities. I like to think I've been moving up in the world, but Stanford, Syracuse, and Ohio in the US, and Ryerson, Laurentian, Ottawa, and now Guelph in Canada. And with this research institute we're doing, and I'm a big fan of all things that sport can do. We're quite involved with participation and driving for sport participation to get people out there and healthier. Very involved with the Paralympic committee. First volunteered well over 20 years ago, and then was very fortunate and honored to be the deputy chef at the 2016 games in Rio, and still sit on a few committees and help that cause as much as I possibly can. So I'll get into a lot of these other pieces in my answers, but just like a long background in sport, passionate about it, and then I've really gotten into kind of the business side of it, which obviously is massively impacted by anything related to inclusion and belonging.
Awesome. Thank you both for those lovely introductions. And I know you're both making such tremendous impacts in the world. Tell us why the topic of inclusion and belonging is important to you. Norm, we'll maybe keep it on you for a moment.
Just a real easy one to start off. Well, I think the one thing I wanted in reflecting, and Andrea shared with some questions with us all ahead of time, and obviously I'm a white male, so I'm in the privileged group, but I was thinking a little bit about, what's been the most interesting for me, and it's one of those things you don't necessarily want to talk about, but you do. But I'm adopted, and so it's when I got looking at your questions and the way you phrase belonging and stuff, it got me thinking a lot about that, and the power in life. So many people who aren't adopted don't understand what it's like to be adopted by someone who you don't share blood and genetics with, but welcomes you into their family and raises you as one of their own. Right. And it's the most amazing thing that's happened to me in my life. And I certainly wouldn't be doing what I am today if it wasn't for those people, my parents, who adopted me. Right. And so there's that was really, I think, maybe the most powerful thing when I was reflecting on the questions. I think, like a lot of us, and Sam, have been very involved with, Aboriginal sport and women in sport, and now trying to do stuff for Black in sport. And my time at Ohio, that was a huge issue, in inclusion and diversity. And you think about sexuality, and as a professor, those things you can do there. But for me personally, that would be, the biggest thing for me in terms of what it means to be inclusive. And it's interesting when you go along in life as an adopted kid and you meet other adoptees, they have a very similar view of the world that you do, and people that are not are very different. And so I think it's maybe my one place as a privileged white male to have felt like it's sometimes, hey, you know what, I can understand what it means to not be, to be excluded, as we like to say, and want to be really part of something. And maybe that's translated in some of the efforts I've made to help some of these other areas, if that helps.
That's awesome. Thank you for sharing that, Norma. I certainly didn't know that about you, and it's an important part of your story and your journey. So thanks for being open with us about that lived experience.
All your prompt questions to got me to think.
Well, I look forward to going a little deeper even. So Samantha, over to you. Tell us a little bit about why belonging and inclusion are important to you.
So thank you. I mean, Norm, it's a tough act to follow, but I think same thing as Norm said, with the way that you sent your questions to us, it really got me thinking about a lot of different avenues around inclusion and belonging, and just what belonging means, and how everyone wants to feel as though they belong and be part of something that's greater than yourself. I got into philanthropy because of my grandfather, and so we were brought up in such a way that we were highly involved in the community, and so I was fortunate, and also from a place of privilege where my grandfather was very adamant about teaching us to serve the community and to work with others, and to always make sure that, if you're moving forward, to be able to reach back and help those who may not be as privileged as you are. And so inclusion to me means so much of just reaching back for anyone, no matter where you are in the world or in your position. Even Fanny and I have had an interesting conversation, being somebody who is in Quebec, for example, who's an Anglophone. I've kind of grown up my whole life as an outsider because I'm not seen as a French Quebecois, which is such a different, turn on a conversation of belonging, where I've just been flat out told that I'm not a Quebecoise, even though I was born and raised in Montreal. And that sense of feeling like a bit of an outsider. And and in all aspects. And I think too, like, again, I am white, so I am very privileged, but I am a female. And in that conversation too, have seen a lot of, especially in sports too, how it can be very exclusive. And so I've been really passionate since I've been in this space of how do we make it a lot more inclusive? How do we always ensure that everybody is properly represented? And when I was working at McGill Athletics, we were always celebrating the fact that athletics ended up being one of the most diverse areas of campus, but we never really celebrated that. And oftentimes it wasn't even reflected in the way that we would market ourselves. And so it's almost one of those things that once you see it, you can't unsee it. So how are we always making sure that, you know, we're properly and accurately depicting ourselves, and always looking around the table and making sure that voices are being heard? Because in any situation, when you have too much of the same, it's never good for business, it's never good for progress, it's never good for society. So always trying to make sure that we're being open and bringing more people to the table. And so it happens everywhere in sport philanthropy. I think that's one of the greatest things, like I said, in using sport to be able to do good and be able to use something that is almost like a catalyst for society to be able to go back and impact and invest into a space and bring people forward.
A catalyst for society. Oh, I like that one. Sam, tell me a little bit. You've been pretty vocal about women in sport and women's representation on boards. I know this wasn't one of the questions I sent you, but you sort of opened up the door. So I think it's an opportunity to explore that a little bit and why that's important to you and sort of how that connects to your journey of being part of a system that maybe hasn't been as representative as it needs to be and continues not to be, I would argue, but I'm sure you'll dive into that.
Sure. So I think working in philanthropy has typically been a female-dominated industry. So when I got into sports, it sort of turned everything on its head in the sense of working mostly with males. It became quite apparent very early on that in order to be successful, you had to almost shrink yourself a little bit to fit in, you know, understand where you stood in a space. Especially I find walking into sports as somebody who hadn't been working in that industry and wasn't an elite athlete right away, the questions were, you know, why do you think that you can do your work in this space? And I'd always answer with, well, I raise money for AIDS research, and I don't, you know, I'm not a doctor, I'm not a researcher. You don't have to have AIDS to be able to raise money for research in that space. But in the sports sector, it was so adamant that if you didn't have all of these qualifications, then you didn't really deserve to be there. And I think especially as women, it is so male dominated. And that old boys club, I mean, it's very apparent. And to your point of the boards, I took a bit of an issue with Hockey Canada and their recent nomination process, for example. And I think we're in a time right now where I don't believe in cancel culture, but I do believe in drawing attention to certain things. And not that it has to be negative, but let's have conversations about that, because just from a purely business perspective, having, like I said earlier, 10 white male faces around a table just is not good for business. It doesn't help with anything. It's not representative of the sport. And I think especially in a case like that with our national sport federations, we're so lucky in Canada to be so diverse, and sport is something that most Canadians are proud of. And there are so many amazing initiatives for new Canadians and for women and girls, and using sport in that space, that I think it's so imperative that at the leadership level, we see someone who looks like ourselves. You know, I think back when I was younger, Manon Réaume, who was the first female to play in the NHL, was amazing. Like, I never in my life seen a woman in a position like that. So until I saw that, I never realized that I could be it. And so when we look at the face of leadership in sport in Canada right now, it's just not representative of who Canadians are. And I do think that, especially if the government is putting money into our sport federations and Canadians themselves are propping up these federations, that we really need to be cognizant and make sure that it's representative of who we are.
Thank you. I want to circle back in a minute to the fitting in piece, but I want to just ask Norm, from a different perspective and from a male perspective, with someone who has probably more letters behind your name than anyone else I know. Where does these types of topics sit with you, Norm, and what's your response to sort of how we move forward?
Yeah, it's a great question, and there's a couple of perspectives. One, I mean, I think in universities we live in a bit of a bubble. So universities are as proactive as anyone could be on these issues. So it's quite interesting for me, and this is the sheltered life you live sometimes in a university, right? Like a lot of these things that are really coming up now, like the Black Lives Matter movement, for example. But I was on committees at Ohio University in 2014 that could have been called exactly the same thing. And the university was very focused on helping the community. And this is a little town in Appalachia, right? As challenging as you can get for white, Black race issues. And on top of it, like investing money, hiring people to get in there, not just talking. Like one of my big frustrations is talking, right? And there's a lot of rhetoric and then nothing actually happens. So universities have been way ahead and on, I think, all the fronts. There's not perfect, but if you look inside most public universities around the world, you'll find that gender and race and sexuality are further ahead. I mean, there's no perfection for sure than other places. I think that's something that's really challenging from being in the ivory tower, so to speak, as you kind of can live this world. Then the other part of my life, I get to do a lot of like sitting on boards, doing consulting work that are out there. I get a chance to try to help organizations on these kind of things. And so you have a bit of a voice, right? Whether you're speaking in keynotes or doing webinars and these kind of things. And the one thing that I think maybe this answers your question best is what's happened in the last year for me is it's really driven home the fact that it's no longer, I always thought it was good enough. And my parents raised me this way. You look at everybody the same, you treat everybody equally. The best person gets the job, the fastest runner makes the team, whatever. Like that was always my philosophy. And that always used to be way out ahead, but it no longer is, right? So no longer is it enough to be passive and supportive and open. It's so much more than that. And you're just part of a structure that's discriminatory if you're not. So the big word, and it's such a simple word for me, is to be much more proactive, much more deliberate. So if you really want to make a difference, you've got to change cultures. And so that's one thing I really learned at Ohio. And the only thing we had success with is quota systems don't work. We all know that. Just it's no good for the quotee and it's no good for the quote. You need to change the culture so people feel welcome, and in your word, belonging in a certain place. And so that doesn't come around targeting certain groups. That comes to building an accepting, welcoming culture. And so that's really the pivot or the shift that I've made in the last 6 months, and the things that I'm part of, as I'm being much more expressive and saying, well, if we believe in this, let's go hire somebody who fits that description, or let's invest in a program to do this, or let's get everybody together. So a very simple example would be at a university level. When you think about, well, we'll start a Black students club or a lesbian students club, or down the list you go. Well, that just puts the people who are already excluded together in a room excluded. So that doesn't work, right? So you got to have interactive, interengaged kind of clubs that have these groups together. So you think, how do we form something, some kind of common thing that gets all of those clubs interacting together? So you get people, whether it's online or in person, that are engaging from all of those different backgrounds. And that's how you change culture. I'm far from an expert, but that would be the shift in my thinking, I think, most recently. So maybe that answers your question.
Well, I mean, I love the answer because it ties back to really why we started these conversations, which was we've commodified diversity and inclusion to the point that it's sort of like some box checking exercises often, rather than looking at, how do people actually show up and how do we support people to be who they are, and support what they need to be successful. And that involves learning about each other. And so when we welcome guests to these conversations, it's about learning about you on a totally different level than your keynotes and your presentations and sort of what you're putting out there to the world in most of the forums that you have the opportunity to speak in. And wanting to kind of dive into those more vulnerable spots, because that's where I believe we shift cultures, is when we're vulnerable and open to each other.
Agreed.
So Sam mentioned around sort of fitting in. So I want to circle back to sort of your individual journeys of belonging versus fitting in, because I would argue that those are opposite. Fitting in means you have to adapt yourself for wherever you're showing up, versus belonging is creating the spaces and places for people to show up as they are, and they don't have to change to be part of that. So Norm, do you want to kick us off sort of talking about your journey of belonging, and even, you referenced earlier sort of that journey of adoption and what that's looked like and felt like for you?
Yeah, I had a different example that I was gonna talk about on this one, which I think is interesting. And so I don't know whether you'd call it kind of reverse belonging, but I grew up in Lindsay, Ontario, which is I grew up in a very monocultural kind of environment, if that's the right word to use. But so when I was working at Sport Canada, so a long time ago, so I was in like my mid-20s, late 20s, and I had a chance to be this is where I got involved in the Paralympic movement. I had a chance to be the consultant working with wheelchair basketball. And so the first AGM I went to was in Winnipeg. And this is a story that I love. And I got into the first room. So I arrived on the airplane, and you're a young person. It was one of my first business trips, all excited, got all these plans, you got all these things you want to do. And you get into this big boardroom with, 50, 60 people, whatever the number was. And I was one of a handful of people that could actually stand up. And so you immediately get this shocking, and I'd never been part of these cultures before, right? And so you get this shocking feeling of, oh, this is weird, this is different, and and then like as the meeting goes on, well, how do we? And I have all these ideas about, how do we grow sport and get more kids involved? And so I asked, what's the main driver to getting young people into your sport? And well, it's drinking and driving accidents. And you're like, so you just kind of go, wow, like how do I deal with, like, all the things I'm going to say no longer make sense, and we're not going to encourage drinking and driving to increase the number of people that are in this particular sport. And I felt like did not belong. I felt like I was way out of whack, and that's where I made the exact decision. And I've been doing it for the last 25 years. This is something that's hugely powerful, and I've learned that, like, Paralympic sport, as you well know, Andrea, changes lives. Like those athletes that find it after an accident, it's the difference between suicide and depression versus, able-bodied sport, which is, something that helps our lives, and some people are professionals and win medal. Like, it's so powerful. And that's where I really fell in love with it. But it really came, when you said that question, it really came from that sense of not feeling part of it, not feeling like I had any idea of how I could even think about helping this culture. And hopefully over the last 25 years have learned enough and have been able to make some difference in that world. And that was my real personal experience with feeling not belonging, and then feeling out of sorts, and then trying to hopefully find a way to overcome that and help.
Thanks. That's a great example. And we've probably all been in situations where you're sort of like, okay, throw that plan out the window, and I really don't know what I don't know. So how do I learn so that I can know, and then be supportive of whatever that journey is? So Sam, same question over to you around sort of your journey in belonging, and how that's landed in some of your experiences.
Yeah, I mean, I think this was a tough one, honestly, when you sent the questions to really force you to think of when you felt a sense of belonging versus when you felt a sense of not belonging. I had a really interesting experience when I was a kid, and I think it really shaped my continuous search. People say, instead of being curious, people will say that I ask too many questions, but I was really fortunate that, just given our language laws in Quebec, I was put into a French school growing up. And so being white and English, I was one of the few in my class. So I was really, really fortunate to be exposed to so many different people and have friends that were mostly all newly immigrants to the country. So I really was lucky to go to so many different types of birthday parties and try different food that I had never tried before, heard different languages I'd never heard, learn about different religions. And so what was interesting is that how we were all so different. And I guess this is the beauty of being a kid, is that you never really see those differences. So you just grow up in this beautiful, naive harmony in a way until you get old enough to understand. But what I really appreciated from that experience was I really enjoyed being around people who are not like me. Oftentimes situations would be uncomfortable just because I'd never been in them before, different cultures and different traditions. But that's always been something that I've tried to seek out in my adult life, and just try to be in those situations. I think it's the best way to grow too, is learning how to get uncomfortable, and being comfortable with that. I do find that, as you grow up, truly a sense of belonging is, as you said earlier, it's about being able to be yourself and find those people that allow you to be yourself and really felt seen. But then, as especially I think as we've gone through these past 6 months, what I found too is almost having to relearn everything, and how, as I spoke to earlier, being a female in sports, I realized, there's all these issues that you have in terms of equity as a female, but then now as our eyes are being open to everything else, looking out for one another, and how do I try to take my experiences of what's happened, just being a female, not being included in certain conversations or opportunities, and how do we turn that and look at it with our BIPOC community and other communities who are excluded. In reading White Fragility, I found it really interesting. The way that it was put was, that women only got to vote, and this was white women only got to vote because men allowed them to do that. And I feel, we're seeing that right now, that everything that's happening, especially with race, it's a white problem. And for us to be able, Norm, as you said, to shift the culture, it's going to be on us to really take on the work as white people, because it is our issue to fix. So much like men gave women the right to vote, us as the white community need to be able to elevate everyone else. It's uncomfortable, right? It's having those conversations and realizing that you're not going to belong everywhere, also that you're not going to be included in everything, and realizing like how to get yourself in and out of those situations at ease, and have those uncomfortable conversations that come with it.
Yeah, thanks for that, Sam. I just really want to blow up the system, but anyways, probably not so productive.
Light it on fire, yes.
The power structures are astonishing when you start to really think about it and break down like who holds the power, and that they're in positions where they give or take it. And that's where I just really struggle with where we're at in our world and how we navigate that forward, and dismantle those power structures in a way that opens the door for others to be part of how we rebuild and create new and build back better. Norma,
For sure.
Yeah, sorry, Sam. I didn't mean to cut you off. When we think about sort of belonging and self and your individual journeys, and Sam, you kind of started to reference this in terms of like, reminding yourself and renewing sort of your learnings about yourself during COVID. But what are some reflections in terms of that journey of belonging and self, and what that's meant in terms of accepting yourself in order to do this type of work and to be able to push your voice forward in the world? So Sam, I'll leave it on you to kick us off.
Sure. Well, I think certainly the past 7 or 8 months now, I guess that it's been, has really, like everyone else, caused me to stop and slow down and do a lot of reflection. I think, my business is going to be 5 years in January, and I should say 5 years old in January. And for so much of that time, I think I lived by that imposter syndrome, fake it till you make it. It's so incredibly scary to put yourself out there and be in that space. And I felt as though I always was having to keep up with this appearance that I knew everything, and that I had all the answers, and that I belonged, and that I was worthy for the space that I was taking up in a room. And that really caused, that really caused a crazy lifestyle. And now that I've been forced to stop and sit, I've never been in one place for this long in my life. I've always been traveling. I've always been in meetings. And I think it's really caused, in a good way, for me to stop and reflect that, be happy and celebrate your accomplishments, but also realize that in order to get where you need to be, you have to value yourself first, and you have to be honest with who you are. And I think I'm really grateful for this time to be able to have looked into that and found some calmness in the sense that I don't need to have all the answers. I can be confident with who I am and take up space because I do belong there. I should be able to take up that space and not feel as though I have to be putting off this different persona. But I think just, yeah, in this space, especially the entrepreneur space and being in a new industry, it is so intimidating, and it just wasn't sustainable to try to keep up with that. And I think sometimes you think everything happens for a reason, and this pause came at a perfect time because I was starting to get sick from it. And so being able to actually take a breather and really look inwards has been extremely helpful.
Nice. What about you, Norm? I'm interested in sort of your experience and through COVID and self-reflection around belonging and self. Tell us about that.
Yeah, I mean, it's a tough one, as Sam said. And I mean, a couple of things came to mind when thinking about this question. And one was just this, in my situation, and you pointed this in my intro. Like I've had lots of jobs and moved up. I've been very ambitious in my career, and always had this real focus. I think as this came from being an athlete and then a coach, on efficiency, right? Like you use your time wisely, you get the most out of your training session, you maximize your time when you're awake. Like I'm a workaholic to the absolute extreme. And and so I've always had that focus. But what really has emerged, and this isn't just COVID, but COVID certainly has accelerated it in the last, let's say, 5 years, and getting into more leadership positions, is that the details, I used to sort of call these things, the details, like little things that are getting in the way of your objective to write the book, get the job, win the race, whatever it is. And so are becoming much more important. And as you become a leader and a manager, you've got to be really, wary of these kind of things. And so I've tried, and hopefully I'm being successful, but and have made some mistakes too, of course, like everybody, but I've tried to be much more aware. So I think it's that idea of, and I think I was not where I needed to be in terms of self-awareness of how you're perceiving things. And you think, as I said earlier, you think because you're being supportive of everybody and you're not looking at their gender or their race or their sexual orientation, you really don't care. Like, I don't care that whoever you are, you want to be. And that's always how I've been. That's not enough. And in fact, you can be insensitive. And in fact, you can be, supporting the cultural things and the structural things in society that you both are talking about. And so that's been the big shift for me. And I think COVID has really heightened that because you have the time to think about it. It's much more focused. And I would say not even COVID, it's really the Black Lives Matter that's been much more powerful. I mean, COVID is horrible, but in terms of these social things, that's way more powerful. I think if COVID hadn't have happened, we'd still be doing Black Lives Matter, right? That incident would have likely still happened and come to the forefront. And the other thing I would add, and this kind of your second part of your question, and it kind of triggered this, was it's kind of been forced. And I mentioned this a bit before in the university environment. So if you want to move up in the university world, which is very competitive and very challenging to get, senior jobs, as a lot of you probably know, in any industry, it's like that. It is part of every application now, a statement of diversity. Every interview process will have multiple questions on how you're going to do this. How are you going to affect change? How are you going to create that culture? And it used to be enough to kind of say certain things. You have to have a plan. You have to have action. You have to be not only just self-aware. So it's kind of a non-answer a little bit, but I'm in that process of you've got to be much more self-aware, much more proactive, much more on top of things, much more deliberate. All those things that we're kind of talking about would be, I think, where my mind is at today. And it's interesting. I would have, when you reflect on what I just said, you think like 10 years ago, I bet you I'd told you I had it figured out. I thought I was like, on the cutting edge. I'm supportive of everything. People choose, like your bedroom is your choice, and the rest of the world we work together. That's not enough anymore. And so that's really where I think my struggle and my focus is now.
Hmm. Yeah, wow, so many layers to each answer. I just want to dive in on so many levels. I'm going to focus on your work experience and sort of the work you're doing in the world, Norm, around sponsorship and sport as a powerful tool. And so I want you to kind of tell us a little bit about where you see sport going and how you think belonging and the whole diversity inclusion, I'm going to call it movement, can leverage the power of sport, but also how sport needs to reconcile how they're being more inclusive as they go forward?
I mean, it's a great question. I mean, and right now, I mean, I get a call every day from a former student who's lost their job. So sport right now is freaking devastated. Everybody thinks because the NFL is playing and the NHL had a successful bubble, sport is back. That's a tiny little petite fraction of our entire industry. Like, it's a disaster, and it's going to be at least a year, maybe more, and who knows what's going to happen longer term, right? So putting that on the table, which is painful. So it's really challenging when you're already in a field that's like, and one of the reports from Stats Can that measure like the number of hours worked in industries, this was one about June, sport and live events was last of the 60 categories that the government of Canada measures in terms of hours lost. Like, there's no wage subsidy, it'd be completely wiped out. So that aside, so within that, yeah, I think we recognize that we got to save ourselves, but then there is a role and a lot of attention that's being paid to sport and its ability to do it. So one of the challenges, and it's interesting, like a lot of these people that are being laid off are in things like digital marketing and things like diversity and these kind of areas, because these are they're amazing things to do, but they're not the core business or the survival tactics of these organizations. So that's there. Second thing I'll say, if we flip this, so that notwithstanding, on sponsorship, and we've been doing some studies during COVID, and this has been wonderful. So sponsors, and this is Canada and the US, but sponsors have immediately focused on not on selling their products. The sponsorship's been cut back by about 50%, but that which rests, it's about frontline workers, about mental health, about helping with COVID, supporting inclusion in the Black Lives, et cetera. Like, everything's gone from, in the past, we kind of needed to have a cause. If it's not authentic, consumers don't like it, people get upset. So there's been a wonderful shift in what's left of the industry towards supporting these kind of things. And I mean, Nike is an extremely wealthy organization, and we all know that, but oh my God, have they done an incredible job in what they've done to bring attention to these issues. In any survey you look at, the ones that I've done and others, they are by far, industry professionals will, we had one with 57 industry experts, 54 of them said Nike was the number one performer what's going on in terms of what they're doing. They're losing money a little bit like everybody else, but they've really, really taken this on. And there's criticisms of these big companies, of course, but in terms of what they're doing and what it means, it's way, way, way above what most brands are doing, right? So, I mean, there's some really positive things in there. And I think the hope is post-COVID, and when the Black Lives Matter, hyper media tension will, at some point will fade or slow a little bit, that this remains top of conscience, top of mind, and top of what these brands are doing. Because as you know, they have way more influence. I got 4 kids. They listen way more to Nike ads than they do to me. So it's like, if you've got that kind of thing out there and these brands doing that and making it important and supporting the players and what they're doing. So at the pro level, those elite levels, very good things are happening. The level below, as I mentioned, it's really tough right now. But I don't know if that answers your question. There's a lot in there, but I think there's been some positivity and a role, but the industry's got to survive in the short term as well.
Yeah, no, some great perspective there, Norm, for sure. And a fantastic reminder about how decimated the sports system is right now. And I know, you're playing a role in helping like the Jumpstart Sport Relief Fund and trying to get funds out the door. And so there's a ton of work to be done right now.
I'm on that committee. Just a quick point, there was over 900 applications from Canadian organizations, which tells you who's struggling, right?
Yeah, I bet. Yeah, no, it's astonishing really how quickly we saw the impacts of COVID hit the sports system and how long-term they're going to be. So thank you for that sober reminder. Samantha, I'm going to flip a similar question to you in terms of social impact through sport investments, philanthropy. Like, what do you see that looking like? How do we connect that into some of the topics we're discussing today?
Well, what's happened, I would say a lot of people now understand what sport philanthropy means. I think in the past 6 months, why we've with what's happened, what I find so interesting is a lot of the work that I had been trying to focus on was really support organizations in situating themselves more philanthropically. So I think what happens in sport is we do not do a good job at demonstrating our value. And so I'm talking about our national sport federations, any grassroots sport organizations, any organizations that are using sport to do good. We don't do a really good job at demonstrating how we are philanthropic to Canadians or to the population in general. And so a lot of the work I've been trying to do was shift and demonstrate that sport should be a charitable purpose. And in that space, I think what's been really interesting now with COVID is it's really shown a light on that. And it's really on us now to say, sport is actually what can save us, both physically and mentally. And the opportunity to just integrate play and to move our bodies, why sport is actually so important moving forward. I would also say that athlete activism is a huge component in sport philanthropy, and we're seeing that right now. To Norm's point, I think in pro sports, I've loved to see what's been happening, and leagues being able to take chances, athletes putting the pressure on. We talked about like wanting to blow up the system and wanting to just burn it all down. Well, when you try to figure out where to even start with that, what has had such a tremendous impact has been the athletes, and the athletes putting pressure on the leagues and their owners. It hasn't really been a lot of the management that's taken those steps. Even at the very, very beginning, when the NBA had to cut their season short, we saw players stepping up to pay for employees, not even the ownership. And so I think it's been really interesting to see how quickly it shifted, how quickly, the NHL was dragging their feet a bit, and then they had to change their tune right away. And so I love the pressure that's being put on the leagues in this space, because I think hopefully we'll see a trickle down effect. I think sport philanthropy is more important now more than ever, and there's so much conversation that can come out of that. I think also, the whole idea of shut up and play is just completely out the window. I think our athletes are leaders in this space, and really coming up with solutions that are going to help. So just even the idea in the US of opening up arenas to help increase voter capacity, and all of the problem solving that we're seeing. And so, I think in this space too, there's so much room for excuses and so much room for just sweeping things under the rug. And I love that people are just being held accountable right now. And I think there is so much good to come from that. Like Norm said, there is still money out there, and we're seeing it being invested in really, really incredible, socially impactful ways. And that is going to help us in the long term. And I can't wait to see more of that, because I think that is where it's all trending. Certainly the companies that we've been speaking to do want to help, and they want to help in those capacities, and being able to be a part of the solution. So I'm really excited to see where it's going to go. I know it's a little bit detrimental in the sports sector right now, but I think it's going to change in a big way, because I think we needed something enormous to be able to throw us off course, and it happened.
Yeah, certainly not in the ways any of us would have wished for, I'm sure. But yeah, wow, 2020. So I want to kind of continue on that stream, because I'm intrigued in terms of both athletes using their voices and how we can shift some of the dynamics and where social impacts can go, in terms of your vision for this. And so, I mean, both of you have incredibly influential voices in having conversations with sponsors or philanthropists in investing in this space. So how do we, one, sort of continue that momentum as we go forward, and those investments, and holding accountable the organizations that are receiving them? And two, make sure that they're authentic in those efforts versus some of the performative fixes that we've seen in the past and even currently. So Norm, maybe I'll start with you.
Yeah, wonderful question. I think let me just talk a little bit of history. I think this is a case where COVID and what's happened now is an accelerant to what was already happening. So we do this Canadian Sponsorship Landscape Study. It's now in its 14th year. It's been a wonderful thing that the industry uses. And there's initial, just to give a little bit of background, in the first few years, there used to be this category we called cause. And so you'd sponsor a pro sport, a municipality, a festival, an arts museum, or a cause, and there was a bunch of categories. That then completely disappeared. And it was very odd as a researcher. Well, that's odd. Like, are people not investing in causes? So we dug a little bit deeper into the Canadian brands. It was like, no, it's because a cause has got to be a part of anything we do in sponsorship, right? Sport or otherwise. So this has already been happening. And then as that has gone on, the demand in people, as you point out, Andrea, that's got to be authentic, it's got to be real. Like the Nike example we talked about, if you're not doing things authentically and following up with investment and actually treating your employees that way and setting your structures up appropriately and having gender diversity work, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, then people are not gonna support you. In fact, they're gonna go in the opposite directions. And then that's kind of where we've got to today. So I think COVID and Black has just accelerated this even more. And then the shrinking resources in the sponsor space. Other parts of marketing, as you know, are booming. Anything related to supply chains at home, healthcare, hand sanitizer manufacturers, these areas are booming and they're spending like crazy. It's just our poor little friends in sport and music and live events that are getting slaughtered right now. So it's those other areas that they're really kind of spending, but it's got to be done in these ways where it's got integrated things. And a lot of these brands won't even look at a proposal from not even just sponsorship, any kind of partnership, unless it includes something that fits with their mission and their give back and a green planet or whatever the case and their focus might be. TELUS is a great Canadian example. I don't have any shares or anything, but if you look at them, they have wonderful programs and they very much focus and they're very honest. Hey, we're trying to market, but we also want to do good things. We call those public-private partnerships, which are really neat and interesting things. So then to the last part of the question about kind of going forward, I think it's just going to be very smart. And again, as part of these studies we did around COVID and sponsorship, one of the things I did is I went to 10 like super elite global people in the field and just got some quotes. And a couple of them was exactly their thing is don't pivot to be frontline workers or COVID or Black Lives unless it's authentic and makes sense for your mission and your brand. You're just going to get slaughtered out there. So I think to your point, Andrea, the organizations get this. The world is paying much more attention. Sure, there's still going to be some that we're not going to like and some things that are done in inappropriate ways and that are going to disenfranchise groups. But I think in general, organizations are getting it and you're seeing how they're responding and they're dealing with employees that are facing with all these kind of things. So hopefully it's going to be an accelerant and we're going to see that continued trend going forward.
I love that framing, that it's been an accelerant. I was working with a major Canadian organization yesterday and having the conversation about authenticity versus performative and connecting back to their values. And in the work that they had undertaken to date around diversity and inclusion, they hadn't mentioned their values. And I was like, where are we starting from? Like, if we're not starting from values and framing that in the purpose of why you're undertaking this work, I'm like, you're going to stumble. So it's like, how do we drive back? Start with values, build that into everything you're doing. And then it will come through. The authenticity will come through if you can live that through values. Mm-hmm. Sam, I'm going to flip that same question over to you. If we can even remember what it was, that was such a great answer, Norm. But yeah, so how are you seeing these pieces trend out on the philanthropy side?
Well, I love, a lot of people, I think right at the beginning of COVID were saying, we can't ask people for money. We can't ask people for money because now is not the right time. But I think what's really interesting, when I started studying the charitable sector, it was right at the height of the financial crisis in 2008. And when you were looking at the data, there was actually an increase in charitable giving. And I assume that we would have the same effect now, just given the fact that it's a crisis. And so, yes, after immediately, supporting the Red Cross and the frontline workers, a lot of organizations were struggling with what they should do with their stakeholders. And I think what I love the most about philanthropy is that everybody wants to have a legacy. Nobody wants to just live and leave and not have any kind of give back or have been known for anything. And so a lot of people are now in a position to be able to give. And so it's really interesting to see where people are choosing to have that impact. I think what's great, again, like I mentioned earlier, is that we're holding organizations and companies a lot more accountable. And I hope that that continues in the future. I think it's been really interesting to watch, you know, how that all plays out. I think with, especially for example, with the NBA going down to Orlando, and the questions like, how are we looking at the league and saying, okay, so you said that you were going to be holding, sorry, my dog is, I have a new rescue dog who's right on my lap right now. So what I found interesting, particularly with the NBA, was that, I asked the question of, well, they say that, Black Lives Matters to them, but in all of the work that they're doing, are we actually seeing that happen? So when they were in Orlando, were they making an effort to employ more Black people? Were they making an effort to sign partnerships with Black companies? What are they actually doing? And so I think those are the questions that we need to be asking. And I think too, we could be looking at how philanthropy is impacting us moving forward. We, for example, with women in sport, that's a huge issue. And so it's looking to philanthropists now almost more so than organizations investing in money to actually help and see actionable change. Because yes, we can name the problem, but what are the steps that we're taking? And it's been really interesting to see philanthropists solving those problems way before companies or governments or organizations are. It's really inspirational to see that. And I think we'll see more of that in the future, because like I said, I think a lot of people want to be able to focus on their legacy, and when their eyes are open to the impact that they can have, it really becomes an investment that they want to be able to make.
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic point that, accountability has sort of shifted from government or funders to the public or the athletes or whatever stakeholder group really holding organizations accountable in a very different way than I've experienced previously. But I don't know, maybe both of you want to comment on that.
Sure, I can go. Yeah, no question. Things and I mean, a lot of that's, I wouldn't say it's driven by necessarily COVID, but it's driven by just the digital world. Again, been accelerated by this massive shift that COVID's driven everybody to be online. So those that were laggards or were behind or weren't planning to now kind of have to. And so we get this, I think I would kind of what's really opened up. Sure, I mean, LeBron James has a massive following, and when he does stuff, it works, right? Like so many people follow and getting people to vote and supporting things, and he makes massive donations. Like you got to give the guy credit, right? But he's a super influencer. I mean, Ronaldo can do the same thing, and J-Lo, we can go down the list. But I think what's really this has opened up is these levels of like micro influencers. You talk about people that have got a social following of 5,000 people or more. Heck, even professors like me can be in that group, right? And so if you have a voice and you're given, and people give you some credibility, you can get out there and make a real difference. I think that's the big shift. Is there's just this disappearance of traditional channels, like who's watching the traditional channels, and nobody is. People are following what they want to, and how do you access them? I mean, you look at one of the big targets is men under 30. How do you, like, most of them may not know there's a pandemic happening, right? Because if it's not affecting them in Fortnite, and they don't even know what's going on. So you've got these huge demographic shifts and cohort shifts. And when we talk about sport, I was going to mention this in my previous answer, but I already had way too much in there. But I mean, millennials, like about 70% of millennials love sport, but 75% of Gen X and about 80% of boomers, it's down below 50% for Gen Zs, right? Like I got 2 of my 4 kids like sport, which blows my mind because that's my life. 2 of them have no interest. But that's the numbers, right? It's so there's a massive shift in sports ability even to reach people in the younger generations because they don't care about it. It's not part of what they want to do. And so we've got this real challenge. And so you really need to get into that level of the micro influencers that affect people, impact people in all these different groups. And that could be that elite gamer, that could be that rapper, that could be that whoever, that professor, that superstar teacher, you go down the list, that can impact that person. And if everyone is passing on these positive messages that we're all talking about and hoping are going to go out there, that'll have way more influence than any government program, right? And so I think I liked how you said that, Andrew. But to me, that's the big shift, is the rise of these micro influencers who truly have influence, right?
No, that's a fantastic point, Norm. Thank you. Sam, I'm going to flip the same over to you, and then we're going to move into our wrap up.
Great. Well, I mean, just even to Norm's point, in philanthropy, you see it could just be influence within your own groups, right? So somebody, somebody who has the means to be able to make a significant gift, and they'll go to all their buddies and they'll be able to ask them, entice them to do the same. A wonderful example was something we saw at McGill with a couple who decided that they really wanted to be able to affect the women's coaching pipeline. And so with the money that they had, they were able to make such a drastic change that's already paying off way faster than the university could have done so themselves. I think then you could, like you said, Norm, you can go all the way up to a LeBron James, who opened up his own school and is changing the way students are being educated, and what kind of an influence is that going to have? Same with Bill Gates. And so I think it's really important to celebrate those influencers at all different levels, and be able to look at individuals who have the means that can just make things happen a little bit faster than they would typically happen, that we've seen in the past, because the impact that it does have is so much bigger than is often expected, and then also serves as a catalyst for us to be able to follow behind. And so it's really important, I think, on that end, to celebrate the philanthropic aspect of these individuals who really do want to have an impact and leave a legacy.
Yeah, thanks, Sam. So we always seem to run out of time on Bridges of Belonging. So we're at the tail end. I'd like to turn it to each of you for sort of a final comment to our guests and sort of a reflection on belonging and your journey. So Sam, do you want to lead us off?
Sure. Well, thank you, because I think it was your questions that really prompted a lot of thinking and shifting in the way I was looking at things. I think, the word inclusion and belonging can mean a lot to a lot of people in different capacities. And I think it's really important now more than ever too, to be able to understand that you can't ever judge anyone. You have no idea where they came from, what their sense of inclusion is, and how to make people feel as part of the group. But I think what's the most important right now, especially in a pandemic, and I'm in Montreal, we're just in a red zone, so can't even see our friends and family anymore, is just really holding on to that, and holding on to people in our community, and always reaching back for others, and making sure that as many voices are heard as possible. And especially for people like us who are white and have the privilege to be able to use that privilege and bring people along for the ride.
Reaching back for others. I love that. That's such a powerful statement. Thank you for that gift. All right, Norm, over to you.
Yeah, yes, thanks. And maybe I can quickly, Finn sent in a question in the chat about sport. And I just want to, he said, like, if government can't support everything in sport, is the role for the private sector? I just wanted to comment, like we've both said, or like sport is huge. We're very well funded now, where we were 10 years ago in terms of Olympics and Paralympics, and own the podium. And those organizations are fine and are safe. It's the next levels down, and clubs and these kind of things, which aren't really the purview of government support, nor are they of interest to corporations. So they really rely on memberships from people participating. And Sam made this point, like, we got to get out there. And even though if you're afraid of the virus and these kind of things, a lot of people are still paying their membership fees for their clubs, or finding ways to support it. So that's really a grassroots thing. I think it's a great question. And I mean, I'd hate for our government to fund grassroots sport with our tax dollars, and I'd hate for corporations to be seen as sponsoring things that don't come back. Philanthropy is Sam's expertise. She can comment on that a little bit different. But in terms of a pure sport and sponsorship, I just wanted to comment on that. It's a great point, Finn. So Andrea, so quickly, I'll be very quick because I know I just took some of my time, but it was wonderful for me to be part of this, and thank you. I was very reflective, as Sam mentioned, and the questions were great. It's not too often you get emotional enough to fight back a few tears when you're talking about some of your stories in a webinar. So I think it's just I'm going to say the word self-reflection. I mean, as I'm in that process and trying to be a better leader and a better person, and not there, but I think this is another opportunity when you put yourself out there to just be more self-reflective. And I'd encourage everybody to be, because the structure of the system, it's not enough just to go along, right? We got to be deliberate and specific. And thanks for having me.
Oh, wow. Well, thank you both for being here, and certainly a rich discussion. And I'm always so grateful that my guests say yes when I reach out to them. And so to both of you, thank you for saying yes to this opportunity. And it was a fantastic conversation. I look forward to sharing it forward on our digital platforms later today, so that those that couldn't be with us can experience it as well. So I just want to wrap up by highlighting our next Bridges of Belonging conversation in English is on October 21st. And we have Richard Peter, who is a highly decorated Paralympian in wheelchair basketball and has also taken up para badminton on the national team. And Riza Izzard, who is actually worked out of the Aspen Institute Project Play in the US and is now working on a PhD around equity, inclusion, and diversity, and brings a really rich background in some of the grassroots work she's done to facilitate sport engagement. So, and then we also have our French Bridges of Belonging kicking off next week. So Fanny is with us here today, and she'll be doing that next Wednesday, the 14th. And so you can register for both of those at inclusionincorporated.com/events. So with that, thank you to our guests for being here and being so phenomenal. Thank you to our attendees, and have a wonderful rest of your day. Stay healthy and well.
Thank you.
Thank you.